Shohei to the Dodgers, Juan Soto to the Yankees, and every major storyline in between. Locked On MLB Season Preview Episode 2 starts right now.
The Locked On Podcast Network presents the 2024 MLB Season Preview. Sponsored by FanDuel.
The 2024 MLB season is upon us, and Locked On has the answers to the biggest questions for the season. Over this 5-episode series, you'll hear from every local host we have covering every MLB team in a way only Locked On can provide. I'm your host, Tanitra Batista, and in this episode, we'll break down the biggest storylines from every team this offseason. Once again, we'll start with the NL West, as Shohei Ohtani was the big offseason prize, and the Dodgers landed him with one of the most unique contracts we've ever seen in Major League Baseball.
And Jeff, Millard called it out. I mean, the Dodgers backed up the Brinks. That was the biggest offseason storyline as far as the signing of Shohei Ohtani. But maybe the bigger question is, how do they follow that up? What's the follow-up? What's the expectation now that that signing is complete?
You know, when the Dodgers signed Ohtani, I said, this isn't a complete offseason because the Dodgers had needs coming into the offseason. And honestly, DH wasn't one of their big needs. They had JD Martinez last year. He was an all-star. Obviously, Shohei Ohtani is an upgrade there. He makes every team better. But he wasn't a complete offseason. I said they have to go all in now after signing Ohtani. And they did. They got the best pitcher on the free agent market. Got, Yamamoto. They got they traded for Tyler Glass now. They got Teoscar Hernandez. They just kept on going because their actual needs were starting pitching and the outfield. And so getting the best free agent starting pitcher and the best starting pitcher who was traded until Corbin Burns got traded later, that addressed the starting pitching. And then signing Teoscar Hernandez, an all-star, to play the outfield, bringing back Jason Hayward to be a platoon in the outfield. Like, they addressed those needs. Plus, they signed the best player in baseball, who wasn't actually one of the needs, except for the fact that when you can get the best player in baseball, you go get the best player in baseball.
Indeed. And of course, our Jeff Snyder of Locked On Dodgers is with us tonight, along with Paul Holden, Locked On Rockies, Miller Thomas, Locked On Diamondbacks, Ben Kaspick, Locked On Giants, and Javier Reyes, Locked On Padres. Now, guys, we talked about this as being the biggest offseason storyline, but I got to ask, Paul, when you look at this, with that particular signing, not just Shohei Ohtani, but some of the others that Millard even mentioned, do you feel like this more than anything puts the Dodgers more than any other team in baseball in true must-win, like World Series or bust mode?
I think the Dodgers have been in World Series or bust mode for my entire existence. It feels like, as a Rockies fan, to be totally honest. I mean, me personally, there is no excuse for the Dodgers left. They just did everything you can ask as a fan. They got better pitching. They got even more depth. And I was watching spring training today, and they have guys on their team that are able to score after being checked back at third, and then they still score and run down. They have just depth everywhere. I hate to admit it, I am jealous as a Rockies fan because of the abundance of riches that LA has had for the entire existence of the Rockies. Now, but I think there is no team that faces more pressure than the Dodgers. I'm plain and simple. This team has to win a World Series now or next year when Shohei is pitching, or else there needs to eventually, as Javier mentioned, the law of averages is going to come. This era of Dodgers dominance is going to end at some point. The bill is going to come due, and I know they're the Dodgers, and I know they got the money to pay for it, but eventually I just think that there's going to be a one-year dip or something like that. I just think that there is something that doesn't seem sustainable to me as an outsider looking at this Dodgers team, but they've been able to maintain a deep farm system with some of the best players in baseball every single season and are in the mix every single season. So I think this team is certainly in a win now mindset, but this isn't anything new for the Dodgers. They've been that way for a long, long time.
Indeed. And, Javier, it's interesting because Paul mentioned either this year or next year if it doesn't happen? What does that look like? And I'm thinking to myself, like, do you even have until next year? Because at this point, to Paul's point, we've been having this conversation and kind of doing this dance for a couple seasons now.
Yeah, I mean, but here's the thing. Like, I think the Dodgers, their big thing is they just have to play good baseball and just not have these moments that we all make meme jokes about for the past 20 minutes, right? Like, if they were even to not win the World Series, make it a series. You know what I mean? I really think that that's the issue here with the Dodgers. I don't think it's just losing. I don't think people hate James Harden, who I brought up in our last segment about how he's known for being a playoff failure. That it's not just that, it's that he's horrendous and he loses and he shoots 10% from the field. The Dodgers swept by the Diamondbacks, losing to Howie Kendrick in the playoffs with the Angels, losing to the Padres, who, as Jeff mentioned also, and has mentioned on many podcasts before, the Padres fans have never won anything, so they're celebrating in the streets over a wild card win. So that's where I think they are. I don't think that it's World Series or bust. I don't like that for any sport, any team, frankly, because I think that it devalues the joy of having a good team to watch in and out. As long as it's not embarrassing, I think they're okay, because they're going to have a lot of these players for a long time. And I don't think that this is a team that is really built into the now. This isn't a team that has a financial issue. This isn't a team that has free agents that are going to be eligible. Freeman's not going anywhere. Mookie Betts isn't going anywhere. Lord knows Shohei Ohtani isn't going anywhere. So I just think that they have to have a really good season. I think they will. Whether they win it all is another discussion. I don't think it's or bust, though. I don't like looking at it that way. But I imagine that for a lot of people, I'm probably the minority on that in order to gain the respect and not be called, 2020 shortened season merchants, they have to win a title, at least soon, whenever that is.
That's fair. That's fair. And Millard, I want to ask you this, because what the Diamondbacks were able to do was simply amazing in their run to the World Series. And you start thinking from the Dodgers' perspective, like, the Diamondbacks might be living rent-free in their heads, and a whole bunch of other teams might be living rent-free in their head. And sort of the mindset that the Diamondbacks had to have in order to believe that they could go on that run and then pull it off. I mean, what kind of mindset was that? You followed this team, you covered this team that entire season. And do you see any differences in how they kind of approach it? Because at this point, you've got all the guns. I mean, Jeff Snyder can attest to it. You got all the guns. To me, then it just becomes a mindset situation.
Yeah, D-backs were a team last year that really tried to play with chaos. It's something that they really embraced all of last season, that kind of philosophy to get on bases, create havoc. And they knew they were the underdog going into that series, going to the postseason. They knew they were not going to be favorited in that series against the Brewers, the Dodgers, every series in the postseason. So they were kind of able to have a little chip on their shoulder. Like, they had a negative run differential entering the postseason. Like, no one expected the D-backs to be there. They're ahead of schedule just to make it to the postseason. You beat the Brewers, and then you go against the Dodgers. You're like, this is the big brother here. This is a team that always knocks you out in the postseason. So the D-backs were going against all odds in that series and the series after that. And they were just playing with a mindset that was like an out-of-body experience for them. Like, the D-backs were playing at a level that they hadn't played all season. They got hot at the right time, and now they entered this past offseason, and it's like they were ahead of schedule last year. They had big needs entering this offseason. They were able to upgrade third base. They were able to upgrade DH and their outfield and their rotation. And so now the D-backs are ready and set up for another postseason battle against whoever comes out the NL West. I think the D-backs are primed to make another deep postseason run potentially in 2024.
Indeed. And maybe that's a part of it, Miller. Maybe you just hit the nail on the head. Maybe it's about playing just a little bit more free, even when you have that kind of monkey on your back or your back's against the wall, all the cliche terms that we hear. But sometimes it's just playing kind of fun and free. And maybe that's half the battle for the Dodgers. So, Ben, I mean, what are your thoughts on it, just in terms of how you look at that, where the Dodgers find themselves with not just the Shohei Ohtani signings, but all of the moves that they made in the offseason and now being here, and I'll go with what Javier said. Maybe it doesn't feel like it is a World Series or bust situation, but certainly there's got to be some pressure on LA to make something happen this season with all of those major moves.
Yeah, and I think that they're going to coast to the postseason as they always do, and they're very likely to win the division and be one of the top two division winners in the league, which means they get a first-round bye. And you mentioned the Braves. They also had that first-round bye. they also lost in the first round. And so this is like kind of a new format that we've seen. I mean, it is new in the last couple of years. And these teams that get the first round bye, there has been a trend where they have lost because you're always playing a team that won a wild card series, played games recently, and won. So they're coming in with a full head of steam, having won a playoff series, and they're not having that, rust factor, which I think we've seen from teams like the Braves and teams like the Dodgers in recent years. And then the other factor is just that this is baseball, and it kind of any team can beat any other team on any given day and in any series. And we see it all the time. If you just watch regular season baseball, you'll see a bad team beat a good team in a series all the time. And so the Dodgers, it's not like the NBA when the Warriors were like the best team and just nobody could stop them. It's not like that, even if you build a super team with all the best players. And so the expectations are like that. And yet it's just not that easy. And which is why at the beginning, Jeff was saying what did they do before and after that? And I said, well, 3 World Series rings. The Giants won 3 World Series.
Oh, long before I forgot.
Yeah, but still, nonetheless, when's the last time the Dodgers did that?
3 years ago.
Quite a while. 3 and 5 years, not 4 years ago.
I just had a perfect solution though to that rust thing. That during the wild card series, the Dodgers could play the Padres in a 3-game series since the Padres won't be doing anything.
You gotta love it. You gotta love it. Listen, Snyder, that'll be a whole other preview and conversation because there's been so much conversation and commentary about that whole format. So I could definitely appreciate that as its own podcast, right? For more around the NL West, check out your favorite Locked On MLB show, your team every day.
Staying out west with the AL West and the division that Shohei Ohtani left, what's left of the Los Angeles Angels and what are the biggest storylines you need to know? We've got Bryce Patrick of Locked On Rangers, Ty Dane Gonzalez of Locked On Mariners, John Frisch with Locked On Angels, and rounding out our crew is Eric Heisman with Locked On Astros. Now, we had some big storylines that happened with these teams during the offseason, Ty. What do you feel like is the biggest storyline for your Mariners, but also across the AL West overall?
Well, yeah, again, you look around the league with the RSN situation and these, the TV deals that have hamstrung a lot of front offices around the league. A lot of teams have gone, well, we don't have any money to spend. I guess we're just going to stand pat and run it back again. The Mariners, after a very disappointing season, they broke their 20-year playoff drought the year before in 2022. There were very, very high expectations heading into 2023, and they did not live up to them after a very poor offseason. And they went, you know what? We have to get better no matter, what it costs, really. And, we have to maneuver this thing as best as we possibly can, despite our owner not really giving us any money to work with. Yeah. And so, they went out and they completely retooled their entire roster. They completely changed the dynamic in that clubhouse. And they've added some guys who are just flat out workers. Mitch Garver is a worker. Luke Raley is a worker. Mitch Haniger is a worker. They have guys that are going to put the effort in. The big question, though, is can they all stay healthy? There isn't a lot of performance risk on this roster, but there's a ton of injury risk on this roster. So that's going to be the big question, and that's really going to determine what the ceiling of this team ultimately is, because this is the best pitching staff in the division. It may very well be the best pitching staff in the entire league, especially if, since Ohtani's not pitching for the Dodgers this year. I think this is the best rotation in baseball. And that's going to be the great equalizer for them. But it's just going to come down to, can they get enough offense? They are arguably as deep as they've ever been in this current regime since it took over in 2016. But again, if they can't stay healthy, I'm not sure how they're going to be able to score enough runs. And, while this pitching staff is really good, you can't win games, 0 to -1.
True. And that kind of brings me to ask you that question, Eric, because as Ty was talking about it, we talked about a little bit earlier, is the fact that you have a team with the Astros that's getting a little bit older. And so that may actually play a part potentially. But you also talked about injuries. You just kind of never know where it lands. But with this Astros team kind of looking to retool and sort of regain their dominance, not just in the AL West, but overall, what do you feel was the biggest offseason storyline for the Astros? And then kind of looking across the AL West overall.
Well, we actually thought that the Astros were in some financial trouble too with their RSN. They actually bought their RSN, the Rockets and the Astros, so now it's going to be Space City Sports. And so we thought that they're losing a lot of money because they're not making the extra revenue this year. They're having to pay a lot. So we really thought that they weren't going to go out there and make any moves. They got Victor Caratini, a great backup catcher. They were letting all these free agent bullpen arms go. And so we're like, okay, I guess we're going to go into this year with who we have. We had one of the most dominant bullpens out there. And then you're going to let Hector Neris and all these guys go. And then there's a big splash. Not only do we go out there and get Josh Hader, one of the best relievers in baseball, but you go out there and also extend Jose Altuve. This is a cornerstone for Houston Astros, and you extend him until 2029. And this was a big deal. And now there's a whole bunch of extension talk. Well, you made all these promises, Dana Brown. You said you're going to extend Bregman. You said you're going to try to do Valdez, Tucker. When are you going to do that? And so that's all the talk is around here, when it should be focused on the Astros getting ready for this next season, where they should compete against the Mariners and the Rangers.
Indeed. But to your point, that Hader move, that was fire. That was one of the better moves. And it kind of reminded me of seeing some of the moves that Dana Brown made during his time here in Atlanta. So yeah, but I hear you just in terms of there are so many other question marks heading into the current season that you're kind of looking to get those questions answered sooner rather than later. So when you look across what the Rangers have done in the offseason, or some may say didn't do, but when you look across that Rangers team, that franchise, and also across the AL West, Bryce, what would you say was the biggest offseason storyline for that squad?
Well, I mean, it's basically a question of what the Rangers didn't do this offseason. There wasn't a whole lot that this team had to do. I mean, the lineup wise, the only everyday player they're losing is Mitch Garver, who's the DH, who's probably going to be replaced by Wyatt Langford, who's one of the top prospects in all baseball. But in terms of the starting rotation, they needed probably one more starting pitcher. They did sign Tyler Mahle to a 2-year deal, but he's recovering from Tommy John surgery. He is one of 3 starting pitchers that is going to be on the IL for about half the season. Max Scherzer had surgery on his herniated disc, so he's going to be out until about June. Mahle is supposed to be back sometime in July. And DeGrom, the hope is he comes back sometime in August, but really that he's fully healthy and ready for a playoff run if the Rangers get there. So the Rangers added a couple of veteran bullpen arms in Kirby Yates and David Robertson. And other than that, there really wasn't a whole lot that this team did. You could use a little bit more help in the starting rotation, because outside of the first 5 guys that you have there, if there is an injury, and there's always an injury to pitchers, pretty much always, and that's why the Rangers are still hoping to bring back Jordan Montgomery as of this recording. He is not signed anywhere. There is still some hope that he can come back, and if he comes back, then it is an A++ offseason. Wasn't much to do. Didn't do all that much, just to hope for one more starting pitcher to kind of shore up that depth and bridge the gap till they get those reinforcements of Scherzer and Mahle and DeGrom back, hopefully fully healthy at some point this season.
But I do like one of the sneaky good moves of picking up Kirby Yates, by the way. I think that's going to pay some solid dividends for you guys. What about the Angels, John? Where do you see the biggest offseason storyline for that franchise, but also across the AL West?
Sure. Yeah, the biggest storyline for the Angels and the AL West is one and the same, and that is, gentlemen, you can thank Artie Moreno for being the worst owner in baseball and letting Shohei Ohtani go to the National League West, because he's no longer going to plague the AL West. But that's the biggest storyline from the Angels offseason, honestly, and how the young players on this team are going to rise up, and the fact that Ron Washington has come into this organization and given this team some real coaching. We've seen a lot of terrible coaching the last 5 or 6 years, and that includes the Joe Madden years. I think that Ron Washington is bringing something to this team that hasn't really been seen since Mike Scioscia, which is a really great thing for Angels fans. At the same time, how do they overcome the void of Shohei Ohtani? And a lot of fans ask, what are they doing to replace his production? Well, number one, you really can't replace Ohtani's production no matter who you add. He is the reigning AL MVP going to the National League. At the same time, the young starters in the rotation are really hungry to step up this year. There's already an emphasis on
pitch efficiency, throwing strikes, getting through at-bats quickly. And to be honest, there's already been some commentary from the young starters about, hey, I'm really looking forward to getting back to a 5-man rotation. I don't need to wait 6 days. I don't need to wonder if Shohei's going to be able to make his next start. And pitchers, they're creatures of habit. And I think that that's going to be really beneficial to the young rotation this season.
And John, you talk about, and we call him Uncle Ronnie affectionately here.
Yes, I love it.
But you talk about Ron Washington, and there are so many players you could go down the roster for the Braves, the younger players like Austin Riley, like Michael Harris II, even Vaughn Grissom, who's no longer with the team. But those are just to name a few. And of course, your reigning NL MVP, Ronald Acuna Jr., who speak so highly of him and his ability to really coach them up and help develop them as young players. So you're absolutely right. You may not have the gun that was Shohei Ohtani, but at least with the guns you still have in place for your Angels, you got the right guy to be able to develop them and help to really hone their talents. So I think it's still a good place that the Angels find themselves in. If
Juan Soto wasn't Shohei Ohtani, but he sure made his own massive waves this MLB offseason. We head to the AL East next. Get ready to say farewell to busted brackets because FanDuel lets you bet on every game of the tournament. Whether you're betting on a big upset or a 1 seed, it's time to go dancing on America's #1 sportsbook. Right now, new customers get $200 in bonus bets if your first $5 bet wins. That's $200 to use on point spreads, money lines. You can even pick who's gonna win it all. And while you're locking in your college hoops picks, check out the MLB odds. It's not a surprise that the Dodgers have the best odds to win it all at plus 320. The Atlanta Braves aren't far behind at plus 450, followed by the Houston Astros at plus 700. Just visit FanDuel.com/lockedon and bet on college hoops until they cut down the nets. The headlines for the AL East this offseason were led by Juan Soto signing with the New York Yankees. What were the other top stories for the division?
Everyone kind of was in unison in saying Corbin Burnes was one of the biggest offseason storylines for the Orioles as well as for the AL East. Was it indeed? And what maybe was another big offseason storyline for this division?
Yeah, I think you'd probably argue he's only the second best player that moved into the division this year. I mean, Juan Soto is one of the best in baseball, and if he is peaking at his talents, him joining the Yankees is incredibly scary. But in terms of what a team needed and how well they addressed that need, it was the Orioles starting pitching, and it was going and getting a former Cy Young winner and a guy who is no doubt top 10, maybe top 5 in terms of starting pitchers in baseball right now. It's kind of out of left field. Didn't really see the Orioles making that big a move, and they did it, and hopefully that becomes the move that completely changes this division, and you don't just say the Orioles are all bats and no arms.
Yeah. And Stacey, everyone's talking about that move that was made by the Orioles. Big move made by the Yankees as well. Is that the biggest storyline this offseason for the Yankees?
Yes, by far. I didn't think in a million years we'd get Juan Soto. I say we as if I'm part of the team, but that kind of shocked me when it happened. And he just makes that lineup so much better. Just the addition of one person in that lineup.
Yeah.
Having him ahead of Judge, I feel bad for opposing pitchers.
I have to tell you, I've been one of those, I want to say closet. I guess maybe I'll be uncloseted if they rise back to the top of the AL East, but I've been a Yankees fan for forever, so I totally get it. But interestingly enough, Stacey, you make a great point, having covered the Braves for a number of years. I can't tell you that I actually saw Juan Soto moving on from his life in the district to moving on to New York. So yeah, I think that was one of the bigger storylines and quite a shock maybe around the whole Major League Baseball. Gabby, how about you? When you look at what the Red Sox did or didn't do in the offseason, what would you say is the biggest storyline for them and maybe the biggest across the AL East?
Yeah, I think you said it, what they didn't do. I think that was kind of the biggest thing for me, was just an overall disappointment in terms of the Red Sox and moves made, because they did finish last in the division last year. So they clearly needed to make some moves to improve the roster. Didn't necessarily do enough to improve the roster. And now one of their biggest moves that they did make is for a pitcher who might miss the entirety of the 2024 season anyway. So not exactly super happy about that, but they did just extend today a very talented starting pitcher that has a lot of potential to be very good. So that's one promising thing that they've done. I think also for them, just their coaching staff, they've improved the coaching staff this offseason. I think that could actually be a lot better for them than is being talked about right now. Got a great guy in here to work with the pitching staff, which could be key for the development of some of the guys they already have. So definitely a little bit of a letdown overall, but in terms of biggest offseason storylines, we definitely covered it already in terms of Juan Soto and Corbin Burns. I think both of those guys are going to improve their specific teams drastically. I think the Orioles having Corbin Burns, a guy who's a veteran with a team that still is relatively young overall, could be huge for them. And with the Yankees, Soto just makes the lineup better. That was definitely a little iffy last year and kind of feels like he pushes them a little over the hump now offensively.
Yeah, and again, a great point, because when you have a young core, oftentimes the managers don't get nearly as much credit, but we've seen how that can make or break a team, especially we talked about this earlier. When you look at some of the runs that were made in the postseason last year, there were some surprising teams, and a lot of that sure goes to the credit of the raw talent on those teams, but a lot of that goes to the credit of how the managers were able to mold and shape those teams as well. And Kevin, what about with the Rays? What are some of the biggest off-season storylines for the Rays, but also that you feel were the biggest storylines across the whole of the AL East?
Yeah, I would agree with everybody else. Corbin Burns and Juan Soto going to their new teams respectively. But on the Rays front, it's their modus operandi of trading veteran, expensive players and trying to get young talent in return. And one of the big moves, of course, was trading Tyler Glasnow to the Los Angeles Dodgers for Johnny DeLuca and Ryan Pepiot. So seeing what those young guys can do and trying to replicate and replace what Tyler Glasnow provided. There's also the remaining ongoing uncertainty of Wander Franco and his legal status and situation. And it's likely he won't play this season or maybe ever again. So that remains floating in the air. And as far as extensions and big maneuvers, I guess not necessarily player related, but executive and coach related, Kevin Cash and Eric Neander have been locked up, and they'll be with the Rays. The expectation is through the new stadium in 2028. So the top leadership, the top brass will be remaining in Rays Union going forward.
Indeed. And yeah, I think you make a great call on that one, Kevin. Like I said earlier, I had the opportunity to cover the Rays, and Kevin Cash is one of the best. So yeah, to lock him up and have him leading this team for the foreseeable future is definitely a good look on the part of that organization. And Braden, what about the Blue Jays? When we look up north, what would you say north of the border was the biggest offseason storyline for Toronto or across the whole of the AL East?
I think it's just the hope that, Vlad is going to have a huge bounce back year. And I think everybody's seeing that he looks way better. He's swinging better. The swing path is all cleaned up. So he looks a ton better. Obviously, the Alek Manoah ups and downs of emotions that are going through fans is huge right now. A lot of people down on him. But overall, in the whole of the AL East, I think we saw last year with the Blue Jays that pitching doesn't win you playoff games. You need hitting, and I think the Yankees going out and getting Juan Soto to pair with Aaron Judge is a huge storyline going forward.
I thought Shohei Ohtani was the Blue Jays' biggest offseason storyline.
That might have been it too. Well, that was my biggest disappointment probably in my entire life. So Blue Jays fans will probably hop on board with me there.
Yeah, I think that sweepstakes got interesting across the whole of baseball, and there are probably 29 teams that were out there going, "Dang, that's."
I think another thing too is that was interesting and also very surprising to me was the Red Sox and Yankees actually making a trade with each other, which is definitely something I did not foresee happening this offseason or really ever. So that was definitely interesting. I think, from the standpoint of the return for both teams, it kind of makes sense why they did it. Both teams, I think, are benefiting for different reasons from this move, but it's definitely something that is worth noting because a lot of people were like, a Red Sox Yankees trade, like, what are we doing here? Like, what is 2024 at this point? So it's definitely was very interesting to see Alex Verdugo go to the Yankees, and the Red Sox got some talented pitching in return. So hopefully it works out, well for both teams, because this was definitely a high tension situation for those two fan bases.
Yeah, I agree, Gabby. Red Sox Yankees trades have happened in the past, but it is very jarring when it does happen. And actually adding Verdugo to the lineup helps the Yankees too. And I will say we had Richard Fitz on Locked On Yankees this past season, and you guys got him in the trade. And he's just a really great kid. He's very talented, and I can't wait to see what he does for you guys. And hopefully he does big things.
Indeed, some exciting storylines in and around the AL East, and how they play out is why you want to check out our favorite Locked On MLB show, Your Team Every Day. So all of our hosts are able to tell you about the movements and the shakeups and everything that's going on, and whether some of these offseason moves, or in the case of some lack of moves, how they will actually impact the race for the AL East.
The NL Central's offseason storylines might be led by returning Cody Bellinger and the Chicago Cubs, but what other storylines will shape this season for the division?
Talking NL Central, Ethan Smith, of course, of Locked On Pirates, J.D. Haffern of Locked On Cardinals, Stephen Offenbaker of Locked On Reds, Chuck Freeman of Locked On Brewers, and Sam Ober of Locked On Cubs. So, J.D., we're starting to kind of touch on it a little bit there, but let's go back in and talk about this. Most of these teams, if not all, have had some serious or some offseason moves, if you will, that kind of make for some compelling storylines this season. But what would you say is the biggest storyline for in the NL Central this offseason?
Well, obviously the Craig Counsell move is, to go from one team to the other as the manager is a pretty big deal. Specifically for the Cardinals, it was adding starting pitching. They moved out a bunch of guys that didn't really live up to what they were supposed to be. They had to trade Jordan Montgomery, who was very good in the postseason, but bringing in a Sonny Gray, who finished second in the AL Cy Young Award voting. And they're bringing in some veterans like Lynn and Kyle Gibson. Gibson wins 15 with the Orioles. I think he's better than people are giving him credit for. Lance Lynn looked like he was done with the Dodgers at the end of last year, but apparently has decided that he's going to get in better shape. Maybe was tipping some pitches last year. The pitching staff for the Cardinals is the biggest storyline for them this season.
Steven, how about you? How about for the Reds or for this NL Central division overall? What's the biggest storyline you see?
I think I'll stick to the Reds on this one. The biggest offseason moves for the Reds, the biggest storyline started with something they didn't do and then transitioned to something they did do. The thing that they didn't do was pick up Joey Votto's option. For the first time in 17 years, Joey Votto is not a member of the Cincinnati Reds. That is a big change for what a lot of people have been used to for a long time. They really have leaned into this youth movement. What they did do was very early in the offseason process, they set a team budget and they let their president of baseball operations, Nick Craw, just cook with it. And he attacked the team needs. We said at the beginning of the offseason, they needed starting pitching, relief pitching, and to maybe address the outfield. They did two of those three things. They went out and signed Frankie Montas. They went out and signed Nick Martinez, who could be a hybrid bullpen or starting pitcher in this rotation. And then they went out and got arms for this bullpen. They added Brett Suter. They added Emilio Pagan. They continued to address the team needs. For a team that won 82 games and missed the playoffs by 2 games, I think they addressed what needed to be addressed to make this team a real contender.
And Chuck, how do you see that the Brewers have done things in the offseason? What's the biggest storyline of what they've done so far?
Well, 2 things. We talked about Craig Counsell going to Chicago. Milwaukee and Chicago do that. There's a bigger hate on Milwaukee's part of disliking Chicago, everything Chicago. We don't even like Chicago people crossing the border to use our vacation land up here in Wisconsin. But all that aside, Craig Counsell going to the Chicago Cubs was the biggest slap in the face and one of the biggest moves in the offseason. So I'll say that. And also Corbin Burnes. Corbin Burnes, the Cy Young Award candidate. The Brewers need an ace at the top of their rotation if they're going to contend once again. And they trade him off to Baltimore. Some nice prospects. A solid starting pitching, but they got rid of him for a song, I thought. We'll see how that pans out, because that moves Freddie Peralta, a number 3 starter, up to the number 1 starter right now, and that's a big, big dip-off. So I think the Brewers losing some top-heavy arms with Brandon Woodruff out for the year and Corbin Burnes now down in Baltimore, that is the biggest shift I would think, in the division as far as pitching is concerned.
Yeah, nothing like feeling like you're walking away with getting nothing for something. Sam, what about with the Cubs? What do you feel is the biggest storyline or in this NL Central division this offseason?
Well, I think we've already mentioned Council, so I think I would just talk about a couple other teams from a Cubs perspective. Responding to Chuck, I think the biggest rivalry in this division for historically has been the Cubs and Cardinals. Everyone knows that. But the Brewers have really been a thorn in the Cubs side since about 2018. So I think from a Cubs perspective, just keeping an eye on that Brewers situation. Is that going to be a rebuild? Are they not going to be a problem anymore? And then I'm really curious to see what happens with the Reds, because they have the Reds, I would argue, have as high of a ceiling as anybody in this division, just with all the young talent and Ellie De La Cruz and all these special talents, and seeing how those guys now, after a year under their belts, play. So I would say those two things are, from a Cubs perspective, I'm keeping an eye on.
Indeed. And Ethan, what about you for the Pirates, and what about for the NL Central division overall?
I mean, when you look at what the Pirates really were worried about this year, one of the things that we've heard before the last 3 years was that they never keep their good players. In the past 3 years, we've seen them keep Brian Hayes on an extension, Brian Reynolds on an extension. You heard the rumors about Mitch Keller possibly going somewhere else. They get it done before the season starts to keep their ace in town for the next half decade. As far as the NL Central goes, I really think it's just the willingness that none of these teams, and I don't know if everybody else agrees with me, really did not look at how winnable this division is when they were attacking the offseason. You look at guys that are still available, maybe not after the time of this recording, but a lot of the guys that are still available, like Blake Snell, like Jordan Montgomery, a lot of these guys that could literally shift the tide of this entire division. And yet every team, in my opinion, really has not done enough to say, yeah, we're really going to go and attack this division. The Pirates included in that. The Pirates could go acquire another starting pitcher, and I would feel a lot more confident about their chances to win this division. And I think almost every other team and every other person on this panel could probably agree with me in saying that.
Indeed. And for more around the NL Central, you guys heard the biggest offseason storylines. You want to hear more? Check out your favorite Locked On MLB show with your team every day.
The Texas Rangers added a stud to their bullpen in David Robertson, but is it a young arm that stole headlines in the AL West? Fire TV is your destination for sports, from live games to highlights to in-depth analysis. Fire TV offers amazing viewing experiences with smart TVs, as well as the Fire TV stick that you can plug into your existing TV that provides access to millions of movies and TV episodes, as well as free and live TV. Whether it's opening weekend for baseball or the college basketball tournament, you're going to want to have a Fire TV. Fire TV recently created Fire TV channels to deliver a constant supply of the latest videos from your favorite sports brands, all for free. This includes all of us at Locked On and most of the big pro leagues and college conferences as well. Fire TV channel lets you dive into all of the game analysis, highlights, and more to keep up to date on all the latest in the world of sports. March Madness, NBA, MLB, and lots more. Not to mention great news, entertainment, gaming, traveling, cooking videos as well. Check out Fire TV channels on Fire TV and Alexa devices. And if you haven't checked out Fire TV channels, you should. Trust me on this. To learn more, visit www.amazon.com/LockedOnFireTV.
You think about the biggest offseason storylines, and you kind of think about some of the big moves that were made in the NL East. And Ryan F, I'm going to go Finkelstein. We're going with you first, and then I want Clary to chime in as well. But when you look at some of the moves that the Mets made, what are some of the biggest storylines coming out of Mets camp, but also from your perspective, biggest storylines for the NL East?
Well, I think for the Mets, it's about being a sustainable winner. That's what they're talking about. And that's why all the moves they made this offseason were one-year deals, basically. They're looking at a longer window. So they're going to try to compete this year. They're not going to be competing with the Braves atop this division. They're going to try to get one of those wild card spots. But for them, it's about long-term winning. That's why David Stearns was just hired to be the president. It's all about the prospects this year, seeing what they have in the system and seeing those guys that were debuted last year, and Brett Beatty, Mark Vientos, Francisco Alvarez, get another year under their belt, see if they can establish themselves as starting big league players, and hopefully be a team that in the future could compete with the Braves atop this division.
And Ryan, you think about the Mets as a team that did everything that they could to put themselves in position to win the division and make a run in the postseason. And you want to talk about disappointments. They had their fair share of disappointments last season as well. What do you kind of see from them as far as win total, or as far as what's going to be the make or break for this Mets team in order for them to have success this upcoming season?
I think they're about a 500 team that could go a little bit in either direction, right? I mean, we saw the Marlins last year sneak in. We've seen the Diamondbacks last year go to the World Series after sneaking in. So I think they set themselves up to be about a 500 team. And if a couple things go their way, maybe they win 85 games and sneak in. I don't think they're going to be a 90-win team. That'd be, I guess, kind of the ceiling I would put out there, is getting to 90 wins if everything broke right. But mostly I think it's a 500 ball club that could overperform expectations a little bit.
And Peter, how do you see that? Speaking of the Marlins, how do you see things going for the Marlins? What are your expectations for them, the biggest storylines coming out of Miami?
Yeah, listen, they made the postseason last season, and what's happened? You've had a full-blown front office rebuild. Kim Ang out, Peter Bendix in. Like, that is the biggest storyline here. The Marlins have had a full-blown rebuild on the infrastructure around the team. They haven't done anything, pretty much, with the big league roster. So Tim Anderson just joining. So it's been a slow and surprising offseason, I would say, for the Marlins. We were expecting to kind of build off the momentum. But really, you have to look at it and think, Peter Bendix, we're going to interested to see what he can do. Like, they're trying to copy the Rays model. I think that model suits South Florida, let's say. So, yeah, I think from a Marlins perspective, they're looking to play 500 ball. And if they're in it at the deadline, see if they can make some moves. I think this division is tough, as we know. Just to go back to the Braves, by the way, the Braves, to me, yes, they're the class right now on paper headed into this one, but it's all about health for the Bravos. They love to roll out their big guys game after game after game after game. And for me, if you get a couple of key injuries, then that completely changes it for the Braves. I'm not sure they're as deep as they are quality at the top. So I think that is the main difference maker for the Bravos. Can they stay healthy? It's the same for everyone, but for me, the Bravos, they've got a lot of talent at the top, and I think it gets a bit thin pretty quickly.
The Minnesota Twins were the team to beat in the AL Central in 2023, but it's been a long offseason. What storyline shaped this division into what we'll see in 2024?
Of course, we're talking AL Central here. We are joined by Brandon Warren, Locked On Twins, Scott Bentley, Locked On Tigers, Jack Johnson, Locked On Royals, and Justin Latta, Locked On Guardians. Now, guys, you mentioned it, that some of the teams, maybe more than others, made some big moves in the offseason. And there are some central storylines that we all want to keep our eyes on throughout this season. Scott, when you look at the Tigers, or when you look at the AL Central overall, what is maybe one, or what are maybe two of the biggest storylines that you felt came out of this offseason?
Yeah, I mean, I'll just play the homer card very publicly. I'm going to say that the team of the Detroit Tigers is genuinely one of the biggest storylines in this division, just because they could finish fourth or they could finish first. And not that those are all the same likelihood, but I think they're all on the table. Like, this is a team that did finish second in the division last year. And as we are very well aware, this is a division that is weaker, right? And as Justin said earlier, mid-80s win total could get the job done in the AL Central. And so for a team that in a division like the AL Central, where the Royals and Tigers, as far as amount of moves, were the most active, right, in this winter, there's a real possibility that the Tigers just have such a big window. There's like a 10 or 15, even if you want to get super dramatic about it, like window gap that they could finish in. It wouldn't be the most shocking thing in the world to me. Tigers added a lot of pitching depth, but the offense has really struggled, but now they're healthy and are young and improving. Also adding some prospects. Cole Keith, obviously a big addition to this lineup. So I just think, and again, very openly being a homer about it, but I do think that the Tigers, just because of their volatility, are going to be one of the bigger storylines in the American League Central, because, I mean, who really knows where they're going to finish? No place outside of dead last maybe would really shock me.
And Jack, Scott mentioned it, the Tigers and the Royals among the biggest movers and shakers this offseason. What do you feel like the Royals' biggest offseason storyline was, and then kind of what was that biggest offseason storyline in the American League Central overall?
Well, I mean, first things first, the fact they were so aggressive back in December
pitching. I mean, here in Kansas City, you felt like they were going to go after maybe one guy, but then they started, packaging together with not only a couple arms for the rotation, but in the bullpen. At the end of the day, though, the big storyline here was extending Bobby Witt Jr. I mean, you go over the course of the Royals' history, they don't keep many superstars. I mean, you look back to Carlos Beltran, that didn't end as well. George Brett was the guy back then you could keep for a long time, but that was a different time in baseball. Yeah. Now it's much different, and it's harder to keep guys, and especially for an organization that never really spent a lot of money. So to get him to that type of contract, it was a massive win for Kansas City. Honestly, the other central storyline, and maybe it wasn't so much of the moves, but the lack of moves, and I promise I'm not picking the White Sox because there's no host to defend themselves, but I'm just been so surprised at how we went from the White Sox 2 years ago. Like, this is one of the scariest lineups in the American League, and now you look up and, boy, I mean, jobs are on the line. They're sellers. Is Dylan Cease going? Where's Eloy Jimenez? Luis? I think for a lot of us here, you look at the Central, and we looked at Chicago like 2 years ago, and it was, I'm not looking forward to playing them the next decade. And now you look at them, and they're kind of the doormat. And this is coming from a Royals guy who's been the doormat for the last couple of years.
Yeah, and that's understood. And when you mentioned Dylan Cease, I kind of perked up because I said, yeah, he was definitely one of the ones that down here in Atlanta, individuals were eyeing and saying, maybe possibility. So yeah, it's been intriguing and kind of interesting in seeing what's been happening there. Now, Justin, when you kind of look at the Guardians and what they did or didn't do this offseason, because sometimes the biggest storylines can be about what you do or don't do as well. What do you see that being, or what do you see being that biggest offseason storyline about what did or didn't happen across the AL Central?
Well, for the Guardians, obviously the biggest offseason storyline was hiring Steven Vogt as the new manager. This will be the first year and since 2013 that future Hall of Fame manager Terry Francona will not be managing the team, and it's a big transition. Steven Vogt is obviously filling some very big shoes. The Guardians / Indians made the playoffs 6 times under him in 10 years, and he's never managed before, and he's only 2 years out of the game. So there's going to be a lot of, learning curves and growth there. And, people really like him. They're really excited about him. There is some Tito Francona in him. People are excited about what he can do. There might be some new exciting changes to how he runs things. So that was the biggest storyline for the Guardians. And yeah, the other thing was the lack of moves, really. There was a lot of talk about trading Shane Bieber or trading Emmanuel Clase. There was talk about Josh Naylor. So none of that happened. The Guardians didn't add anybody. And I think, yeah, maybe it was or wasn't the biggest storyline, but the bankruptcy for Bally's loomed over everybody's head. The Twins' head, the Guardians' head. The Guardians may not have made any moves even without that, but it certainly hung over their heads. It hung over the Twins' heads. I think that was a big storyline of the offseason, and it's unfortunate for the fans that it might have cost their teams from making moves or keeping certain players and having a chance to maybe solidify themselves in a wide open division.
Yeah, you're absolutely right, Justin. That ended up being the storyline for a number of franchises across Major League Baseball in terms of where were they going to go with their RSN or where were they not going to go with their RSN. And it did kind of loom as a storyline that none of us wanted to kind of tap into, but just kind of kept kind of rearing its head throughout the offseason. Brandon, what about the Twins? Where do you feel that their biggest storyline was this offseason or across the entirety of the AL Central?
Yeah, it was how the budget would be affected by the RSN stuff. But outside of that, because it was covered very well elsewhere by many other people, Byron Buxton going back to center field, and if he would be capable of doing that, is going to be big for the Twins because foundationally everything they do kind of revolves around him. Power, speed, defense. So I'd be curious to see how he is feeling, if he can stay out there 70 games, 80 games, 100 games, or shoot for the moon a lot more than that. So we'll see what happens there. But injuries to him and Carlos Correa are going to definitely be something to watch. Rocco Baldelli is really good about managing players' time off and that sort of thing, running guys through the DH. So at the end of the day, we'll see what happens there. And then, yeah, the inactivity in general for the AL Central, the Twins took forever to do anything. And given their budget issues and budget, whatever, whether it's self-imposed or otherwise, they got very creative. Like a 4-for-1 with Jorge Polanco is a very creative trade. You know, back-end starter, a good prospect, a good reliever, and a lottery ticket. The whole, though, division, just looking at everyone outside of Chicago, I think, dealing with that is I don't know where it's going to go from here. The Twins have one more year with Bally and Diamond, and after that, it's hard to say. So hopefully it's a one-year blip on the radar screen, but at this point, we don't really know.
Yeah, you absolutely hope it is. Like you said, a drop in the bucket, kind of one thing that we move over for this season, and then we just kind of move forward, because it has kind of been that thorn in the side that across the, like I said, the entirety of the league, we just haven't been able to get past this RSN conversation. Now, if you guys want to know, especially because we just talked about the fact that there were some big moves that were offseason storylines, but some of the offseason storyline was big because there were no moves. You want to know more about it and how it impacts what goes on in the Central Division across the 2024 season? Check out your favorite Locked On MLB show, your team every day.
Now that we've heard the biggest offseason storylines for every MLB division for 2024, check out the rest of Locked On's MLB season previews, including over-under win totals for every team, the division winners, and who are the MVP candidates. Don't miss an episode by subscribing to Locked On MLB, part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day.